Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up,
the story of a place so thoroughly emerges from that site that the work simply cannot exist anywhere else.
How can the story of a piece of land influence the design and development of what happens on it? We'll explore the landscape architecture work by the Nelson Byrd Woltz studio, which is putting history, sustainability and the public realm at the heart of it all. Then we turn to urbanists, young and old. First, a series of colouring books trying to engage children with the built environment from a young age. And then we're in Singapore to explore some of the design and community-driven solutions to tackle a rapidly ageing urban population. That's all coming up over the next 30 minutes, right here on The Urbanist, with me, Andrew Tuck. Our first guest today is Thomas Woltz, the owner and senior principal of Nelson Byrd Woltz, or MBW, Landscape Architects. MBW have recently released a monograph titled The Land is Full, which demonstrates one of the firm's foundational ideas, that all land, urban or rural, comes with a deep history and cultural ties. It features 12 parks and public gardens that showcase the power landscape design can have in creating a public realm that connects to communities and enriches the natural environment. Earlier, Monocle's Carlotta Rebello caught up with Thomas, and she began by asking what his path was to becoming a landscape architect.
I, as a child, always wanted to be an architect. I was fascinated by construction and buildings and space. I used to take bamboo poles that my parents were quite happy for me to chop down any bamboo because it was very invasive, and make plans of full-scale buildings all the time and then walk them through when they would come home from work. So I went to architecture school. Upon graduation, I moved to Venice and worked for an architect for 5 years. And there was ironically, my epiphany to landscape architecture, because I was living in a city that had fantastic outdoor spaces. I had very satisfying landscape experiences, but in a city made of stone, pavement, buildings, water. There was nothing that I had perhaps naively thought was the landscape. So I thought that was probably my gateway to understanding the landscape as an abstract construct. It's basically anything outdoors you can design, and you can design the poetics of the human experience in space.
And there's this interesting element as well about landscape architecture, that it really is made for the public. It is about, those shared spaces for the public realm, what's at the heart of a community. Do you feel like that's something that has become more understandable by the wider population than perhaps just within the practitioners' realms?
I think we still have a long way to go for the public to understand how public spaces are conceived of, designed, and made. And I always advocate for the role of landscape architecture because it really is a unique toolkit. You can always tell when a public plaza has been designed by an architect. It's a feeling of the multi-layered experience that I believe you get when a landscape architect has been involved. And let me explain that. So you have an awareness of the dynamics of human behavior, movement, gathering, ideas about shade and air movement and human comfort, but you also have the design of infrastructure. And I think landscape architects have a particular mission to design public and utility infrastructure in ways that are beautiful, that take into account the human experience. By that I mean stormwater management and drainage. So in public landscapes, you can actually manage that water, hold the water in constructed swales filled with plants that clean the water and process it, but it becomes an amenity in the park. It's not water to be drained away as quickly as possible. So I see work in the hands of civil engineers and architects all the time, and I feel like when they all come together under the aegis of a landscape architect, you have a very different idea of public space.
Well, you mentioned there's stormwater, and that leads into, the discussion around climate-centric design and designing with climate change in mind, not only about stormwater management, but also the urban heat island effect, increasing biodiversity and so on. And I know these are some of the core points made in this new monograph. So as a way of getting us to talk about the book, perhaps let's take a step back. And what was the inspiration and the aim? What led you to, wanting to compile this collection of projects and works?
The Land is Full is really the result of a brief window of this practice. I've been here for 25 years, and The Land is Full represents just the last 10 years of public park design and construction. So the title is very near and dear to my heart and is something that kind of emerged when trying to advocate for a certain kind of process when approaching land. I firmly believe that the land beneath our feet, wherever we stand, is full of both ecological and cultural history. And it behooves us as a civilization, before we enter that landscape, before we redesign it, reimagine it, grade it, we erase its record. Before we do those things, it behooves us to ask the land its question. And when you start building this deep history of a site, and you understand from its geologic formation millions of years ago all the way through to today, you start to discover an incredible dance between our species, human beings, and the ecology that supports them. We alter that ecology alters our culture. And you start to document this extraordinary dance over hundreds or thousands of years. You know that land in an intimate way. When it comes time to meet the requirements of the brief or the project program, stakeholder groups, the client or city commissioning the landscape, you have so much authentic information to draw from that you're actually pushing away ideas. And it becomes a design of editing down to the most salient, essential points that only that land can hold. It's the opposite of a fashionable graphic design or a notable signature move that a designer might have, that you recognize that work wherever you go. In fact, it's quite the opposite, that the story of a place so thoroughly emerges from that site that the work simply cannot exist anywhere else. At the end of that process of deep research, the design ideas flow and gush. And I keep coming back to this idea of a counterpoint to words like green space, empty space, vacant land, tabula rasa. All land is full. So to use that as the title for these 12 recent public parks was a way to really underscore that message and set the stage for the work inside the book.
Well, give me some of the examples here, because I'm curious to hear how, the story and culture of a piece of land, as you were describing it, how it can influence the design.
An example is Centennial Park. It's a major park in Nashville, Tennessee, and it was the site of the 1879 Centennial Exposition, celebrating the 100 years since the founding of the city. It had been the exposition grounds, around 1895 to 1910. There were expositions in Paris, St. Louis, Chicago, New Orleans. Many, many different cities hosted one, and Nashville was no exception. These expositions lasted generally about 6 months, and all the temporary buildings, usually these sort of stucco confections of neoclassical temples, were all destroyed. The leadership of the city of Nashville said, well, we have this large piece of cleared land, let's turn it into a public park. The park never got a design. It was just filled with parking lots and roads and ball fields. It was very much catch as catch can. We engaged in this site and were told that there was really only one period of significance. It was the 6 months of the expo. And our response was, surely there is more to this piece of land than the 6 months of the exposition. And what we discovered was that the first woman to have free and clear title to land west of the Appalachian Mountains owned this. This was her farm, and she herself managed it. She also built the first colonial school, and a major feature of this farm was a spring, a very bold spring. Through our deep cultural research, we read letters of settlers and travelers and people coming into Nashville, and they would say they knew they were home to the city when they had the fresh, cool waters of Cockrell Spring. This pioneer woman's name was Anne Cockerell. So we started to look for maps of creeks and rivers, and sure enough, found where we could best locate the spring, excavated. We found the actual spring that for thousands of years had been surging in the park. So we daylighted the spring, we brought the water to the surface, and are now able to tell this extraordinary pioneer woman's very authentic story in the land that she owned, with this long-lasting natural feature of a very bold spring. In my mind, these are the moments where we actually hold hands with history. What we designed there was a very contemporary solution. We didn't try to refashion a babbling brook or make anything very quaint. We made a very clean terrace with a square fountain basin, and inside that the original wellhead is submerged, so you can actually come and touch the original wellhead. Some of the inadvertent uses, some of the local churches use it now for baptisms. Because it's fresh spring water, children play in it. It is just an extraordinary example of daylighting a lost and forgotten story and reconnecting the people of the city to both their natural and their cultural history.
It is an amazing example of the practice's work on connecting people with the natural world. How important is it then that designers, planners, architects think on this human scale?
I would rephrase your question slightly, if you don't mind, in that we design at the human scale, but I think we are capable of remembering the human scale in the scale of urban infrastructure. And I mention that because there's an example in the book, Memorial Park in Houston, Texas, and in that project we had pretty audaciously suggested a way to overcome the 6 lanes of highway that was built in the 1950s through this massive urban park, that a way to stitch that back together would be to design a 100-acre prairie that would lift up over the 6 lanes of highway and back down the other side, bringing with it warm season grasslands, wet grasslands, and post-oak savanna that would be 3 natural ecosystems native to Texas that could give the human being this extraordinary experience of getting 40 feet into the air with spectacular views of downtown and uptown Houston, while completely forgetting the presence of a 6-lane highway beneath your feet. So it is a wildlife corridor. There are tunnels for amphibians and reptiles that go under the highway. The highway is above that, and then humans and terrestrial animals cross. It's an extraordinary 3-layered intersection. So it's an example of large-scale infrastructure that is absolutely designed for the human experience, that really represents the triumph of green over gray infrastructure, but in a park-like setting that is bucolic and has become immensely popular. The last factor about that project is that when the land bridge touches ground, it lands in a vast basin that is graded to hold the size of the most recent hurricanes that have struck Houston. So it actually is a highly technical stormwater management facility that looks like just a beautiful prairie with walking trails and bird blinds and wildlife overlooks and shelters around its edges. So that's an example of, yes, thinking about the human experience, rebuilding biodiversity, facing climate extremes, all in a usable public landscape that tells us the ecological history of Gulf Coast, Texas.
Thomas Woltz in conversation with Carlotta Rebello, and MBW's monograph, The Land is Full, is out now. Nurebemeo Olezola is an architect and illustrator based between London and the Basque Country, who combines her 2 passions in a variety of ways, from public murals and educational illustrations to visualizations which help in securing permits and approvals for construction projects. Burmi is also a published author, with 2 children's colouring books released by Reba Books under the name Colour and Create Architecture. The books aim to introduce children to the language of architecture, promoting sustainability, collaboration and inclusivity in a fun way. And I'm delighted to say that I'm joined down the line now by the author. Burmi, thank you so much for joining us. Now, we're keen today to find out about how you engage a younger generation in thinking about urbanism, city planning and architecture. And these books have really captured the imagination of these audiences. Tell us a little bit more about Colour and Create Architecture and what you're aiming to do with these books.
Initially, Riva Books wanted to do their first children's architecture book. Initially, I was commissioned to illustrate the book, but I became quite involved and I ended up developing the entire book, the characters, the story, the writing. I wanted to create a story with a character that helped children think and be more aware of the scale and the spaces they live in. The character, Georgie the giraffe, is very tall and has difficulties fitting into daily places. He lives in a house that doesn't fit. He's tired of living like that and decides to go on a trip to find a new home. And then playing with this idea, we introduce children to the language of architecture, designing their own buildings, exploring perspectives, and appreciate different architectural styles.
Tell me, as your giraffe character goes around looking for a new home, you say there that you introduce people to some of the ideas and words that come with architecture. Give us some examples of the things that he comes across as he goes on his journey.
At the beginning, he's in his house and the house is very tiny, so he doesn't fit. So he takes his bike and a little caravan and he starts exploring new places. So playing with this, he goes to a forest. He sees a forest house that could be interesting for him because they are very tall, but then he realizes he can't really fit on the neither. He goes to a city and he realizes the buildings there actually they are much taller than him. He or she actually goes to the sea and it kind of fits in a little submarine. So from the submarine, he sees a lovely lighthouse and he thinks that could be quite appropriate maybe for him because for the shape of the lighthouse, maybe that could be a good home for him and little things like that.
And tell me, what has the response been from young audiences who have seen the book? How easy has it been to get them to think in a playful way about architecture?
I think the children quite like it. They find it quite interesting to see different perspectives. You can see high-level perspective from the top and things like that maybe they are not that used to. And yeah, it has this kind of mix of storytelling with activities and promotes the sustainability, collaboration and inclusivity.
Just tell me a little bit about your career then. What made you interested in architecture and this world of the built environment?
Well, good question. Actually, people is often surprised to know that I am actually an architect. I never imagined myself I could be an illustrator. My journey into architectural illustration was quite unplanned, but step by step, my passion for drawing and visual representation naturally guided me somehow to this field.
You've made some projects yourself then. You've had an impact on cities. You've created some public realm.
Yes, luckily I have done few educational panels and maps around UK. I recently created a wall mural in Croydon in a rooftop garden, specifically designed for children, so they can play and engage with their surroundings. The lower part of the mural is great for babies and toddlers, showing the nature with lots of facts, numbers, letters, fun little games, like follow the lady Byrd. And then as you go higher in the illustration, it becomes more detailed for older kids, featuring Croydon landmarks, transport, the city, the weather, the constellations. This mural is on a tower called College Road in London, designed by HTA Design, and it's actually one of the tallest modular buildings in Europe. Another one is one of my favorites in London as well, in Kidbrooke Village, in Cator Park, designed also by HTA Landscape Team. And it is an educational ecological panel that shows a cross-section illustrating the park's habitats, the wetland, the local wildlife, the sustainable drainage systems. This project was particularly interesting because we work with the London Wildlife Trust, so I learned a lot in the process.
Amazing. You've been able to combine your passion for illustration and your career as an architect and an urban realm maker. The two cross over back and forth quite a lot during your day.
Yes, exactly. I feel quite lucky, to be honest.
Burmy, thank you for joining me. And Colour and Create Architecture and its sequel are now available through Reba Books. Now, it's not a new thing, the need to adapt urban areas and public spaces to a rapidly ageing population around the world. But this is particularly urgent in Singapore, where it's projected that by 2030, 1 in 4 citizens will be aged 65 and above. With most Singaporeans living in public housing, the city presents a unique opportunity for adaptation for the older generation to be done right, with design, community and green spaces in mind. Monocle's contributor, Adam Hancock, went out to explore some of the work being done to address this, and he sent us this report.
I'm walking around a housing estate here in central Singapore, and it's not hard to see that this country has an ageing population. To put it quite simply, I can see a lot of old people. Now, most of these elderly people live in tower blocks known as HDBs. They provide affordable public housing for Singaporeans, and I'm looking up at one right now, and I can see lots of washing lines that are hanging out of the many windows above me. Now, whilst this is a good housing solution for a city like Singapore with limited space, living in big apartment blocks can make socialising with neighbours pretty tough. It's certainly a change from the Singapore of old, which was made up of small villages known as kampungs. Their houses were built on stilts for ventilation, with open verandas to encourage a sense of community, with neighbours talking to each other on a daily basis. Families relied on wells for water and often raised chickens and grew their own fruit trees and vegetables. But with the demise of kampungs, there is now just one left in the country, and the increase in high-rises, many Singaporeans feel this so-called kampung spirit has been lost. In fact, a recent study found about 40% of the elderly feel lonely here, with researchers saying it's an overlooked public health challenge in this ageing country. But a new project called Kampung Admiralty could bring some of that sense of community back. To find out more about this new model for housing Singapore's elderly population, I've been to the offices of Woha, a local architectural firm.
I'm Pearl Chi, one of the directors of Woha Architects, and I'm also the project leader for Kampung Admiralty.
I've been reading a little bit about Kampung Admiralty. Are you able just to describe a little bit about what the problem was, first of all, and how you went about trying to solve it through your work as a designer?
Kampung Admiralty actually look at a few issues that everyone faces globally. So it's about communities, family nuclear becomes smaller and smaller, and how do we avoid isolation in a housing estate. The apartments for the seniors are quite isolated as a single block, a standalone block. So they can easily be isolated in their homes. But the project looked at how to integrate these flats. And it also talked about how to help seniors to age in place or to be active as they age in place. We always think of taking care of them when they are sick or they are quite old. But the project looks at what happened before that. How do we keep them active and how do we enable them to be independent and age actively?
So how did you go about trying to solve this problem? What designs did you put in place at this project?
So 7 agencies came together to co-locate a healthcare, public housing and social facilities. And we wanted to inject a lot of public space and green spaces into the building so that the community is enhanced, the elderlies have outdoor spaces and they are socially connected. And they also have facilities at their doorstep. So these are ways to avoid any isolation or alienation as they stay in their own apartments. Yeah.
And has it been successful so far?
Very successful. The public space, it is becoming the heart of the community actually. The government is also wanting to kind of duplicate. Of course, this is one of the models. I believe the government agency in Singapore are looking at various kind of home assistant models or public housing models to tackle the elderlies, but this is definitely one of the very effective ways of integrating public flats for elderly inside this building.
Well, one place that is the heart of the community for many elderly Singaporeans is the coffee shop. I'm at one now, and there are plenty of old men and women here, or aunties and uncles as they are affectionately known. Now, despite it being pretty busy here today, I can see a lot of uncles just sitting by themselves. Some are reading the paper or looking at their phones, whilst others are just staring into space. And it is largely older men that hang out in these places, rather than visiting one of the many active ageing centres that have been set up across the island. So to check in on these uncles, one local organisation has designed a unique programme to connect with Singapore's ageing population. I went to meet Wendy Chua, who co-founded local design studio Forest in Wales and has been working on this project with the Liam Foundation. these coffee shops, which they call Kopitiam here, right? What is the culture of these places?
So you can think about the coffee shops as like the communal kitchen for our housing blocks. So for some seniors who live alone now, they might not be cooking anymore, right? So they settle their meals. They have their 2 or 3 meals a day at the coffee shops downstairs. And that's where they hang out. That's where they have their coffee. So in this project that we're doing, primarily we're looking at elder isolation. So how do we get them out? And how do we connect with them in what we call the pre-loneliness phase, before they are isolated at home because of disabilities? And so it's really important that we are engaging with them in these community spaces where if they don't hang out at a coffee shop for maybe 1 day or 2, somebody in the coffee shop is going to get worried.
When you go into one of these coffee shops, how are you approaching these men and what are you saying to them and what sort of work are you doing with them?
If you were to go into this coffee shop and start, bring out your clipboard and your notepad and your pencil, you're going to scare them away. So what we've created is a method called life story ethnography. And one person will be interviewing and one person will be doing a caricature sketch of the elder, and we find out more about their life and we try to sketch their life story into that sketch.
And we have some photographs here of the project underway. I can see here Mr. Huang, who I believe is 90 years old, and he is drawing their painting even at a table. So can you just tell me a little bit more about him?
He hangs out at this table in a coffee shop at the same time every day. It's his only exercise, just walking out to this table and sitting down. He doesn't like the centers, the community centers, because he finds it too noisy. And we found out later that he was a Qigong master. He was a calligraphy master. And so when we did a life story sketch with him, we asked him to pick up the brush and write his name on it. And over time, we thought, let's do calligraphy sessions with him. Let's engage him to write calligraphy and gift it to the communities. And he would just sit there and he would write the scrolls, and different neighbors from the community would come by.
I mean, it looks like in the photos I'm seeing here that he's having a good time. He seems to be enjoying himself. Are you seeing a lot of success with this project?
Yes, definitely. I mean, in the first place, to have younger people, with the student volunteers, being interested in their life is already something that brings a lot of pride to them, that somebody actually thinks my story is important. And then to be able to connect them with a community, and these are neighbors who might have walked by him every day but may not have known about him or may not know that he has this skill. And after that gifting of a calligraphy, they are going to say hello to him every time they see him now, so he's going to be more socially connected.
By 2030, Singapore is projected to have 1 in 4 of its citizens aged 65 or over. And it's certainly not alone. With humans living longer and birth rates declining, many societies around the world are going to need to think about how to deal with ageing populations. The work being done here to design a better world for our senior citizens could one day be the blueprint for coping with super-age societies. For Monocle in Singapore, I'm Adam Hancock.
And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. Remember that you can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider. You can also subscribe to Monocle magazine for regular reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism. Just visit monocle.com. This episode of The Urbanist was produced by Carlotta Rebello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.